Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the 22nd Annual Acquisition Research Symposium. We have another outstanding day with a keynote address, plenary panels, and research panels. I'd like to take a moment and give a shout out to the researchers who are presenting their research. They are the center of gravity of this symposium. None of their research is funded by NPS or ARP, but they are presenting their results, research papers, and presentations because they are committed to advancing the acquisition sciences field so that senior leaders and policymakers can make informed decisions about how to improve and reform acquisition policy and results. It's not easy to share your results, research results. You will open yourself up to criticism, debate. But without the benefit of this research, the success that acquisition policy reform changes have will be minimal. The DoD will have a difficult time innovating and reforming defense acquisition to meet the evolving demands of our warfighters and keeping pace with an adaptive threat and a fast-changing technology landscape. Using the symposium research to inform policy change is innovative. It can make a real long-lasting difference in the results and the outcome of acquisition reform. And now I'd like to welcome the Acting Vice President, Provost, and Chief Academic Officer for NPS, Dr. Jim Newman. Dr. Newman was previously the NPS Chair of the Space Systems Academic Group, and after a distinguished career with NASA as an astronaut, including 4 missions, 43 days in space, 6 spacewalks totaling 43 hours, to successfully accomplish these space missions, Dr. Newman understands better than anyone the importance of knowing that the equipment he used in space needed to be rigorously developed, tested to the highest standards. He understands the criticality of program management, contracting, test and evaluation, life cycle logistics, engineering and technical management, financial management, and cost estimating. He understands from a user perspective the importance of acquisition. Dr. Newman, over to you for day 2 opening remarks.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Bob. It is my pleasure to help open today's Acquisition Research Symposium. When I launched into space aboard the space shuttle to help assemble the International Space Station, I wasn't thinking about my spacesuit's contract vehicle or the system engineering process behind our docking adapter. I was thinking about executing the mission and honestly trying to make sure I did not screw up. And I could focus because I had full confidence in the spacecraft and equipment. That trust didn't happen by accident. It was built through rigorous acquisition across engineering, testing, program management, contracting, logistics, and cost estimation. Now, say you wanted to take a picture like this. How would you do it? Well, take Hubble. During our servicing mission, I installed the advanced camera for surveys, a breakthrough in imaging that transformed astronomy. But what made that possible wasn't just rocket science, it was acquisition science. It was the ability to translate operational needs into technical requirements, to contract for precision components, to test under extreme conditions, and to manage risk across a global supply chain. Okay, we made a little mistake when grinding that first mirror, but we were able to fix it by going back and putting in corrective optics, more acquisition science. Now, this image reminds us of what's at stake. Our ability to see, decide, and act faster than our adversaries. To deliver relevant capability at speed and scale, we need acquisition rules and systems that evolve. And we need a force of professionals, trained and empowered, who understand how to lead across the full acquisition lifecycle. That's where NPS and the Acquisition Research Program come in. NPS is the only institution educating acquisition professionals in a defense-relevant, graduate-level setting. And this symposium is where research, policy, and practice converge. It's my pleasure to introduce NPS doctoral candidate Major Dylan Pierce. He will now take a moment and dive into one such possible innovation, a cost capability inversion model that could help reshape how we develop warfighter capabilities, such as small, low-cost missiles. It is an example of how innovations and acquisition can flip the script. We'll always need exquisite capabilities and exquisite acquisitions, but there is room and need for non-traditional acquisition as well. Major Pierce.
Thanks, sir. As Dr. Newman mentioned, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Major Dylan Pierce. I am a Marine Corps active duty infantry officer and space operations officer by trade, and currently a PhD candidate in the astronautical engineering program at the Naval Postgraduate School. As a warm-up for today's great agenda, the purpose of my presentation is to provide a brief overview of my dissertation research and follow-on assignment, and to highlight some of the unique ways we're thinking about technology transition to the warfighter at NPS. As a brief background, I'm a graduate in 2019 of the Master of Space Systems Operations program at the Naval Postgraduate School. And importantly, for my utilization tour, was the Space Capabilities Integration Officer at Headquarters Marine Corps Combat Development Integration, where I had the distinct pleasure of instantiating the material space capabilities portfolio for the service, authoring functional concepts, requirements documents, and transitioning multiple programs from S&T ideas to programs of record. I say importantly because it was here that I established the foundational experience where I saw firsthand the gaps between warfighter needs, acquisition pace, and the technical feedback loops, which led to my doctoral research focused on bridging them. For my dissertation, I specifically sought to close capability and capacity gaps in our guided missile inventory through a novel approach to guided missile development, which traded selected performance parameters for orders of magnitude reduction in costs and increase in production capacity. Highlighting the figure in the bottom left right there, I'm talking about going from traditionally high-performing, exquisite systems but with high unit costs and limited production capacity, to a space on the bottom right of high production capacity, low unit cost, and moderate capability. This would be achieved through a framework that draws inspiration from agile development practices and lean development and resource-constrained innovation with 4 key tenets: rapid iterative development, incremental capability building, commercial component integration, and resource-aware design. Now, as you just heard from my dissertation supervisor, Dr. Newman, it's not just enough to theorize about these capabilities. We actually have to prove it and empirically validate it. So I wasn't able just to theorize about the model. Unfortunately, this was an engineering dissertation, so I have to demonstrate the efficacy by actually building a guided missile system myself using these principles. So that's exactly what I did. And over the course of 43 test flights, 3 capability increments, in 18 months, I created a GPS guided missile system at a unit cost of under $5,000 with a total cost of under $300,000 for development using consumer grade components and materials, things we can buy readily off of the internet. This demonstrates that complex missile systems, and by extension defense systems, can be developed quickly and cheaply by a small team or even an individual when the process is lean, focused, and test-centric. And now, some fun this morning, I'd like to show you the final test demonstration of the GPS guided capability, which shows the launch of the missile system right here. So unfortunately, we don't have sound for the video, so I'll talk you through it. We have the launch of the system. Well, right here, the missile itself achieves a velocity of approximately Mach 1.3 and an apogee altitude of about 7,000 feet, launched at a relatively steep angle for the short target distance. We'll see a little bit of controller retuning necessary at apogee right here as it's going relatively slow. And as it regains aerodynamic control, you see the target marked by a blue tarp come into view. And I paused the final result, and it ended up doing pretty well. And if you'd like to know more about the final results of the impact test, please contact me. So maybe the most important part of this is, in order to operationalize the model and transition from what was a feasibility study in the dissertation to a scaled innovation approach, we're establishing a new construct at the Naval Postgraduate School, which will remain at NPS, but be OpCon to Marine Corps Combat Development Integration. And this unique construct will embed a capability developer, myself, into a hands-on development loop enabled by academic and strong industry partners to build and shape solutions directly against evolving operational needs. The goal of this is to break from traditional serial development approaches to an integrated iterative approach where the acquisition burden is front-loaded to in development, requirements generation, concepts of employment, RMF artifact generation, transition SAMP plans for the program managers, to build consolidated acquisition packages for transitions directly to the warfighter or to our systems commands and PEOs. In conclusion, this isn't about replacing traditional acquisition, but rather complementing it with a faster, more adaptable layer of capability development and recognizing that the cost performance curve can be inverted when we rethink who builds, how we build, and how fast we learn. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to any follow-on discussion or questions in the forum today. Sir, back over to you.
Thank you, Major Dillon. And what a fantastic example of what is the center of gravity of NPS. And now I'd like to invite someone you all know very well to introduce our keynote speaker, Vice Admiral Dave Lewis, a past NPS acquisition chair and still on the faculty as a professor of practice. Please be nice to him. He's teaching his first class for us this quarter. Noteworthy to mention that Dave recently earned his education doctorate at Vanderbilt in leadership and learning organizations. His capstone project focused on technology adoption practices in the U.S. Navy and how to improve them, titled, "Can the U.S. Navy Get Its Mojo Back?" Dave's project assessed the U.S. Navy innovation technology adoption practices across 2 centuries and 4 industrial revolutions. Over to you, Vice Admiral Dave Lewis, to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thanks, Bob. I'll keep this short. I'd like to introduce Sean Stackley, a good friend and shipmate and longtime boss. Sean has done many things in his life, but I think for this audience, the most important is he spent 8 years at ASN RDA leading the Navy's acquisition community. And I would say more than leading, I think initiating and sustaining a renaissance in acquisition. Just a few of his accomplishments: LCS restarts, Canes, Spy 6, DDG 51 Flight 3, AFSB, MLP, DDG 1000 delivery, DDG 51 restart, along with many other programs that I don't know anything about. So that's a tremendous legacy. But I think his most important legacy is during his time, he led the award of contracts for more than 60 ships. Given the fleet size today, my math says that's more than 20% of our active duty fleet today. Hulls in the water that would not have been there had it not been for Sean and his leadership of the Navy's shipbuilding and acquisition community. So with that record, Sean, over to you. Welcome.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Dave. Thanks for the introduction. You ought to be giving this talk. You ought to be breaking out your thesis and giving us at least the synopsis. But hey, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to join the symposium here. You've got an all-star lineup of speakers, panels. I enjoyed yesterday. I'll touch on some of that today. And let me just say that, and you know this, Dave, but I've had the opportunity to work in defense acquisition for more than 4 decades, and it's stretched from design to production, operations, and maintenance, policy making in the Pentagon, and of course program management at the Navy Yard. And then as a civilian, first on the Hill with invaluable experience, then my time as RDA, and more recently out there in industry. And throughout those decades, there's been an unceasing cry for greater efficiency, greater urgency, greater technical performance, greater innovation, and ultimately there's been an unceasing cry for acquisition reform. And the nature of the beast is there's always going to be a need for greater efficiency, urgency, innovation, and performance, all driven by the unceasing march of technology, ever-advancing threat, and the demand for greater fiscal responsibility, particularly as the national debt looms ever larger. And our responsibility, as Steve Morani eloquently described yesterday, is to provide for the common defense, to protect the nation. So what's different today, this time around, which we heard throughout many of yesterday's panels and remarks, is that where once we held a 2-generation edge in technology and could operate with impunity on any sea, that edge has eroded such that today We're in a race for technical superiority, and we're losing ground fast. So the topic of this symposium, transitioning technology to the warfighter, it goes right to the heart of today's great national security challenge. Now, I've had the pleasure of speaking at symposiums past, and I thought it'd be instructive to take my remarks from 10 years ago and scorecard where we were then, where we are now, what worked and didn't work, then where do we need to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and how do the lessons of the past help guide us going forward? So 10 years ago, I shared Wayne Meyer's classic tutorial on the subject of weapon systems acquisition, which he called profound simplicity. And for Bob Mortlock, if your predecessor, Dave Lewis, failed to make it a part of your curriculum, it needs to be. And I'll start with one of those simplicities, which is time is your enemy, and inaction because of any uncertainty could be deadly. That's every bit as true today as it was 50 years ago when Wayne Meyer was the Aegis program manager. And one of the great uncertainties of his 13 years at the helm was money, the budget. And he knew that if his team hesitated because they were distracted by all the noise of the budget process, that funding shortfalls and schedule delays would become self-fulfilling prophecies. So he gave his team this simple standing order: spend it like you got it. And that standing order applied to much more than money. The message he was delivering to his team was to move out with a sense of urgency, to do whatever was required to solve the problem they were working on, and he would provide them the high cover they needed so they wouldn't have to look back. Time is your enemy, and inaction because of any uncertainty could be deadly. Spend it like you got it. Every PEO and PM needs to copy that down in his or her own standing order book, then operate by it and unleash the team's great talent and energy. That's the cornerstone of acquisition. No reform necessary. And I'll come back to that. So 10 years ago, there were 3 threats in particular that kept me awake at night. First, the Budget Control Act. In testimony, I referred to it as disarmament without a treaty. Second, the rising cost of our weapon systems. John McCain was, at the time, the greatest voice in Congress for a strong defense. But he made it painfully clear that his ability to support the defense budget we needed was contingent upon our ability to maintain the public's trust as good stewards of their taxpayer dollars. So our greatest ally was also our fiercest critic, and getting costs under control was his top priority, so that made it our top priority. The third threat, the rise of China. Well, today, thankfully, we can take the BCA off the list. However, it's merely been overtaken by endless continuing resolutions, which arguably wreak as much havoc. The cost of our weapon systems continue to rise, and that remains a problem. But somehow, the defense budget has managed to rise even faster over the past 10 years. And why? It's that China thing. China has propelled itself from an increasingly capable adversary to a peer competitor that's overtaking many of our one-time discriminating military advantages, and that should be keeping everyone up at night tonight. Now, I described that Xi Jinping has a 40-year plan, and in this, his 10th year of that 40-year plan, he's right on schedule. Well, simply put, we need to disrupt his timeline. In a theater where China holds significant asymmetric advantage in terms of numbers and geography, we need to restore our asymmetric advantage in terms of technical superiority. So 10 years ago, I highlighted 22 next-generation capabilities that were in development or testing, all of which were deemed critical to ensure our superiority at sea against the emerging threats. So bear with me as I go through this list. The DDG-1000 destroyer, the Air and Missile Defense Radar, the Ohio Replacement Program, now Columbia, the Joint Strike Fighter, Gerald R. Ford, the LCS Mine Countermeasure Mission Package, the DDG-51 Integrated Air and Missile Defense Baseline Mod being tested on the John Paul Jones, the SM-6 Standard Missile, E-2D Advanced Hawkeye, Navy Integrated Fire Control Counter-Air, the 8A Poseidon Maritime Patrol Aircraft, Triton, unmanned maritime patrol aircraft, Surface Electronic Warfare Improvement Program, CWIP, Next Generation Jammer, Amphibious Combat Vehicle, the Electromagnetic Railgun, the Transportable Electronic Warfare Module, or TOOM, Surface Ship Torpedo Defense System, Advanced Technology Laser Weapon System, or LAWS, Long Range Anti-Ship Missile, LRASM, and the Ground Air Task Oriented Radar, GATOR. And within each of these major weapon systems, particularly the DG-1000, the Ford, Columbia, JSF, Poseidon, there are countless advanced technologies that are being developed and integrated, which promise to provide our warfighters with that discriminating capability they could rely on for decades ahead. So where are we today, 10 years later? Others are going to score it differently. But I'd argue that about a third of those programs, slightly more than a third, AMDR, DDG, Integrated Air and Missile Defense, SM-6, E-2D, NIFCA, the P-8A, the Amphibious Combat Vehicle, LRASM, and GATOR, they've proven highly successful. Now, about a third suffered significant cost and schedule setbacks. And they'll likely be scored as marginally successful until the time comes when their kinks are worked out, they're fielded in numbers, and their early days are forgotten. The JSF, the Gerald R. Ford, Triton, CWIP Next Gen Jammer, and I'd include on the list, though they're far from completion, the Virginia Payload Module, Block 5 Virginias, and the Columbia. And a little less than a third were terminated or truncated or wholesale restructured because they proved unaffordable or simply were not meeting the need they promised to build. DG-1000, Mine Countermeasure Mission Package, Railgun, TOOM, Surface Ship Torpedo Defense System, and LAWS. Now, it's not time to go through the eaches, but in a very non-scientific manner, without all the data DOT&E and GAO would demand, apologies to GAO, I'd argue that those highly successful programs had common traits. They're evolutionary in nature, their technical requirements, though highly challenging, were well understood. They fill a critical, absolutely critical warfighting gap, and they are put into the hands of our best program managers and PM teams, and were supported stable requirements and stable funding. Now, in contrast, those marginally successful programs likewise have common traits. They're all highly complex with very demanding requirements, arguably excessively so. Their true cost was not understood at the time of award, and they relied or rely upon concurrent development and production. But two, they're too big to fail. So we muscle through the production and drive the capability to the fleet. The remaining third stretched the bounds of technology or broke the cost curve and frankly, were not too big to fail. So they were simply terminated or truncated or radically slowed. So what's the takeaway? First, perhaps more of an observation than a takeaway. The 22 programs highlighted a decade ago, they were all contracted with the traditional defense contractors, Lockheed, Northrop, Raytheon, GD, Boeing, HII, and their capabilities, they're being stretched. For a second takeaway, let's consider the combat action this past year in the Red Sea and over the skies of Israel. Aegis destroyers equipped with the integrated air and missile defense capability first tested on JPJ and armed with a family of standard missiles, including the SM-6, performed flawlessly against a series of high-density raids, MRBMs, cruise missiles, UAVs, textbook engineering, testing, and training. A second cornerstone of acquisition, no reform required. Which brings me to a third takeaway. While the Aegis weapons system performed flawlessly in the Red Sea, we can't imagine that a high-density raid over the Red Sea is anything like a high-density raid over the South China Sea. Magazine depth quickly comes to mind. The directed energy systems designed for that threat, railgun, LAWS, those are stuck in R&D. What's more, the time, money, and talent which have been spent on systems that aren't fielded are resources taken away from other critical priorities. That's a huge opportunity cost. So we have big work to do. The final takeaway I'll offer is that while there's a deafening call for greater innovation, when you consider both our successes and our failures over the past decade, there's no lack of innovation in either column. And at the risk of oversimplifying, what's lacking in the case of our failures is a full understanding of the technical risk posed by the complex problems we're trying to solve and a sufficiently incremental approach to solving those problems. It's Wayne Meyer's very first profound simplicity. When it comes to major programs, you must be sure you know what the problem is that you're trying to solve. Then take that one large, seemingly insolvable problem and break it down into a large number of smaller, solvable problems. And in his words, build a little, test a little, learn a lot. Now, let's fast forward and look at a similar list of advanced capabilities under development in 2025. Now, you create your own list, but I'd include the Constellation Frigate, FFG 62, Project Overmatch, and all it brings with it, the family of autonomous unmanned systems, air, surface, and subsurface, the family of space-based ISR&T systems, hypersonics, cyber warfare systems, artificial intelligence, next-generation air dominance, and future ship classes, DDX and SSNX. These are all game-changing capabilities that will be critical in a China fight, and each brings wicked hard problems to solve. Add to that the need for speed and scale. Frankly, it's a moment of truth. How well has the department defined these wicked hard problems, and what have the discipline to break them down and build a little, test a little, learn a lot? Now, I was impressed listening to the speakers and panels throughout the day yesterday, hammering on the need to maximize competition, require open systems architectures, leverage mature technologies, employ the right contract terms, conditions, and incentives, make greater use of other transaction authorities, MTAs, procure at efficient rates, incentivize investment by industry, maintain strict control over change orders, streamline, tailor, and in short, return to the basics. Again, acquisition reform not required. So let me touch on that first need, to maximize competition. It's worth noting that in contrast to the advanced capabilities highlighted a decade ago, from unmanned systems to Project Overmatch, space-based systems, hypersonics, cyber, and AI, the list of advanced technologies is replete with non-traditional players. And while it's early yet, these non-traditionals are bringing newfound energy, capital, and yes, innovation to the competition. A second need, which I didn't hear clearly yesterday, I believe, will be absolutely essential in going against China. And that is a whole of government approach to solve the large problem. It's a page out of Xi's playbook. And I see leading indicators in the current administration to put us on that path. It's promising. Now, I would like to close on the subject of innovation. When someone quickly points towards greater innovation as the solution to our many great challenges, I can't argue against that. But I don't know what I'm agreeing to. It's too ambiguous. To me, our large complex problem is, what's it going to take to win the war? And every program that we launch better be a part of the solution to that problem. And then innovation, well, that means putting aside all the policy and process governing acquisition and bringing the country's great technical industrial base to bear to do whatever it takes to solve that problem on a timeline that matters. That requires complete understanding of the warfighter's dilemma, technical expertise, and tremendous leadership to overcome the inertia inherent to our acquisition system. So let me give you the best example of what I'm trying to describe. In the last wars, in Iraq and Afghanistan, many of the weapon systems needed to win the wars were developed during the war. Improved lightweight body armor, unmanned systems providing persistent ISR, counter-IED technologies, and most importantly, the mine-resistant ambush protected vehicle. There's not time today to retell the full story, but the story of the MRAP is the story of America turning our great industrial might into our great military might. It's the story of America taking care of our men and women in uniform. And it's the story of a small group of dedicated professionals at MarCorps Syscom who turned a small niche industry into the largest program in the Department of Defense. Now, the program manager of that small group was a Wayne Meyer-trained GS-14 combat systems engineer who left the Aegis fold when the war broke out to make a more direct contribution to our troops in harm's way. He took the PM position for a small program that built and delivered 100 roadside mine clearance vehicles built by a small business in South Carolina, Force Protection Industries. In a few years, having completed delivery of those vehicles and now in sustainment phase, and at a time when the greatest threat to the mission was the IED, the Marine Corps was taking note. These mine clearance vehicles, when they triggered an IED, the crew survived. In fact, the vehicle often survived. And so rather than persist with the up-armored Humvees while waiting for the future JLTV, the Marine Corps was interested in procuring more of these vehicles for which they had requested $0 in the budget. So without an approved plan and without a budget request, in the course of routine budget cycle briefs that year, that GS-14 PM told the SAS staffers that the Marine Corps believed they needed to continue buying these vehicles. So when asked how many, the PM's response was immediate, 2,400, which was a number that exceeded the Marine Corps' entire procurement budget. It was the shot heard around the world. And within a week, Secretary Gates was being called by Senate leadership. So returning to the Joint Chiefs, he met stiff resistance from another service and their concern that these vehicles would serve no purpose beyond Operation Iraqi Freedom. Well, he ended the discussion and disarmed the bureaucracy with his own profound simplicity. If you're in a war, it's all in. I don't care what we have left over when it's done. The requirement for MRAPs went from 0 that year to 25,000 and was fully approved, appropriated in an out-of-cycle budget. And production went from 12 per month to 1,000 per month. And that GS-14 PM, he went from managing an unfunded program to managing the largest program in the Department of Defense in a time of war. And in the process, he completely rewrote the rules for acquisition. He greatly simplified the performance specs, accelerated the survivability test program at Aberdeen. He partnered with industry, large and small, commercial and defense. He invoked DX ratings for all his critical components. He managed the flow of vehicles from 7 prime vendors, had them deliver their vehicles to Charleston, South Carolina, where Spayward Charleston installed GFE systems on the vehicles. And then he built an air bridge across the Atlantic with C-5s, C-17s, and yes, Russian Antonov 120s, delivering vehicles in theater until the production ramped up, and then he began shipping by sea. He built a depot in Kuwait to commission and service the vehicles, and over the next few years, he crisscrossed the country tirelessly, driving production, test, delivery, and in-service support with the introduction of the department's #1 priority. And when the time came that MRAPs were required in Afghanistan, he repeated the miracle with the development and introduction of the MRAP all-terrain vehicle. In a $1 trillion war, the MRAP cost $25 billion, saved countless lives and limbs, and gave our troops the confidence, and when they left the fence line, the confidence to perform their mission, knowing that their vehicle would get them back safely. That GS-14, well, later he'd be rewarded with promotion to SES and assignment in the Pentagon. Yes, rewarded with assignment in the Pentagon, where he'd be imparting the lessons that he learned on other programs. But with the rise of the ballistic missile threat, he again ran towards the sound of the guns, whereas the PEO for sea-based missile defense at MDA, as ballistic missiles threatened terror to Israel, shipping the Red Sea, he, Paul Mann, continue to do whatever it would take to win the war. Well, in a few short weeks, after many decades of service, Paul will be retiring at MDA. In his time, no one has performed with greater efficiency, urgency, or innovation. So when I'm asked about acquisition reform, I tell whoever will listen that we don't need more policy or regulation or even streamlining. We need more good people. And then I tell them about Paul Mann and the story of the MRAP. Congratulations, Paul. Wayne Meyer is smiling down upon you. And be sure to tell your relief that time is your enemy. And inaction because of any uncertainty could be deadly. And tell them to spend it like you got it. So Dave, over to you. I'd like to tackle any questions that the group may have.
All right. Bob is the curator of questions, but while he's doing that, Paul Mann didn't just appear out of the ether. He was found and trained and selected. What do you see for the process for finding the future Paul Manns and the future Sean Stackleys within our acquisition system? Any tricks of the trade or suggestions? We have 1,300 people watching this symposium, and most of them are leaders or future leaders. What do you see as the traits for the up and coming acquisition community for them to spot or for them to show in their performance of their duties? Or
Yeah, Dave, that's the thing, right? I think you and I both, and Paul Mann, and you can list countless others, we had the great benefit of starting our careers, in our cases, down on the waterfront, dealing with, I had 3 first-class ships that were just hell. They were hell to deal with in terms of technical, in terms of brokering the gulf between what the government needed and what industry had to offer, and the contracts that stood between, and always trying to keep your eye on the schedule. It's the most important thing, I believe, is that hardcore experience. And what the leadership needs to do is push people in the direction of, waterfront. I'm saying waterfront experience in terms of designing and building the future weapon systems. I had my boss on the waterfront was Paul Robinson. That guy was awesome. And he was not a micromanager. What he did was he assembled his team. He made sure that everybody understood what their role was, and then he turned us loose. And we screwed up. I mean, I don't, John Ingram taught me, never count the number of times you almost ran aground. We screwed up, right? But we learned in the process, and we learned at a stage in our careers where we could survive that, and then just make those lessons, those experiences, a part of our DNA, and then carry it forward into, when time comes that we're in charge of major programs. And we had the benefit in those days of large number of programs in development and production, design, development, and production. There are fewer today. And when I look at, and this is not casting judgment, when I look at things like, take the frigate program, the team put in charge of this new ship class, which was going to be a mod repeat of an existing design, well, they're all being asked to do something that they had not done before. And so the odds of success were harmed by the fact that they were literally learning on the job. We've got to find a way to drive that learning process earlier in our professionals' careers. So by the time they're being called upon to step into the breach, that they understand what's coming, what direction it's going to be coming from, and be prepared to, deal with the challenges and the issues while keeping their eye on delivering the product.
I think you're absolutely right. I do remember the generation ahead of us they had been involved in multiple ship classes. I mean, I was privileged to be involved in two, but I had bosses that had been involved in 5 or 6 ship classes. So you're right, that experience opportunity is coming down, has come down. But I appreciate your statement that it's a point of getting the junior folks out into the field to get them get their hands dirty, manage things, and allow them to make mistakes. I think that's a key point. Is I like that. I had not heard John Ingram's almost running a ground quote. That's very good. That's going in the book.
Yeah, this is not a question, but let's take a look at where we are right now.
Yeah.
When you think about the challenge that we have in submarine construction, Columbia coming, Virginia, Block 5 Virginias. We're going to be looking at, extending service life of some of the older submarines. The amount of work that we're pushing through the submarine community, government, and industry is unlike it has been in 40 years.
Yes.
That's a 40-year, call it a gap. That's a 40-year span of where we've lost experience. And now we're learning on the job. So what the government has got to do, and to some extent industry, we've got to make sure that we're not leaving it to that team alone to deal with the challenges. We need that whole of government approach to ensure that this top priority for national defense, strategic deterrence, does not go off the rails.
I agree with that. Bob, I see some questions are popping up in the Q&A. Do you want to bring a couple of those forward?
Yes, sir. I think the first one relates to the MRAP case study that you mentioned, sir, and this one deals with the challenges with budgets, and those aspects. Particularly when you have a program of record versus an MRAP situation where it was kind of unlimited funding and overseas contingency funded, and so can you comment on what you see as the potential challenges or suggestions to navigate in an uncertain budget, particularly with programs of record?
Yeah, well, look, there's always going to be challenges with budget. Okay, I mean, our national debt is $37 trillion. At some point in time, that's going to come crashing down on us. And the key, first and foremost, is when you're building your program, when you're setting your program up, make sure you understand the requirements and don't go beyond that. Don't go beyond that. DDG 1000, I don't, cost realism was not one of the requirements for DDG 1000, unfortunately. And that's why it ended up in a ditch. Technology was awesome, challenging, awesome, but it was just going to be unaffordable, not just from procurement, but throughout its life cycle. So you got to make cost one of your requirements when you're putting together the design of your ship or major weapon systems, pardon me. So that has to be a part of your requirements. And every decision you make, you have to keep an eye on what does this mean in terms of cost. And don't go beyond your requirement in terms of exceeding the capability that's required in pursuit of technology. Understand what's required to do the job. Understand what's going to cost to do the job. And then make sure, communicate that far and wide. Don't go quietly in the night. I'll invoke another friend of Dave's of mine, Fred Parker. Fred Parker, he held up he was the DG-51 program manager, held up the entire defense budget because he said he could not live with the number that he was being handed down from all the various cuts throughout the process. Well, I can remember, Lee Buchanan was RDA at the time, and he called me, and I was dazzling ships, and he said, "Hey, who's this Parker guy, and why is he trying to hold up our budget?" And I kind of explained what was going on. He said, "Well, you tell Parker that if he's not going to sign this out, I'll sign it out on his behalf." Well, what that led to was the right discussion at the right level in terms of what the issue was, and then correcting the budget, and in certain cases, backing off some of the requirements so that we could press forward with, in that case, it was a 3-ship buy of DDG-51s. So you got to understand your requirements. You got to understand what's going to cost to deliver your requirements. If you're a program manager and a program team, you have to fight for what it's going to take budget-wise to deliver those requirements. And then you got to manage within that perimeter. You can't freelance. You can't let changes take hold of your program. You got to stay within that perimeter. It's C-spot run, but by God, that's what it will take. Now, the budget vagaries in terms of, they get cut by the hill, things get stretched out. You got to understand that there's going to be a continuing resolution. When I was on industry, people talking about contract awards, I said, that's not going to happen. There's going to be a continuing resolution. That's going to be held up. You're not going to see that till maybe second quarter. And you got to build your program with that in mind. And part of building your program with that in mind is building stores in terms of financial stores so that you don't run out of money before you run out of the thing that you're trying to build. So the funding flow, the budget, that's all got to be a part of your calculus. There's never going to be a free lunch. And no, I disagree with somebody said that there's unlimited funding for MRAPs. There's $25 billion, $1 million a vehicle, and we're going to deliver 25,000 vehicles for that. It wasn't unlimited, but it was a priority. And there was a way to get more money through out-of-cycle budgeting if required, which is the other thing you have to understand is the budget cycle and the ways that you can get more money out of cycle. Now, the last thing I'd say is portfolio management. I think, there's a lot of work went in the last year or two in terms of PPBES reform or whatever the title is, but PPB, budget reform. And it was all focused on appropriations, or primarily focused on appropriations. And a lot of ideas, some good, some less, came out. But the one I think that's taken great hold is the concept of portfolio management. And you see the Department of the Navy with some of the pilots, I think when Admiral O'Connor was IWS, I think she was one of the pilots for portfolio reform. And the concept is simply that let's reduce the number of line item appropriations, go towards portfolios of capabilities, authorize and appropriate towards those portfolios, and give the acquisition team working with their sponsor the flexibility to move money around within those portfolios to deal with changes that come in terms of real world, in terms of priorities, threats, et cetera. So I think for the basics in terms of program manager, I covered what I expect. And but looking forward, I think the world is recognizing there's a need for greater flexibility for managing money to go against our priorities. And I think things like portfolio management will go a long way to helping solve that problem.
Thank you very much, sir. And I think the next question is kind of a trailer to that, because you mentioned requirements and understanding the requirements and managing to the requirements. And this has to do with how do we deal with requirements creep when the requirements are set, the threat environment is evolving, technology is evolving, and there's time to develop things. But how do we have that balance between requirements creep to accept the fact that maybe there is a need for requirements change, but also managing to those requirements?
Yeah, so this is a true sea story. So I was in this organization called Daz and Ships, and I was at a stage in my career where the next job I was competing for was program manager. And this is for Dave Lewis's benefit, by the way. He owes me. I threw my head in the ring. I thought anything I had done my whole life was destroyers. That was it, destroyers. Whether it was in the fleet, whether it was in construction, design, maintenance, destroyers. And in Daz and Ships, destroyers. So I got on, I want to be the destroyer program manager. Well, so did Dave Lewis. And my boss was Paul Schneider, the god of acquisition. And Paul's going to take care of me. So Paul calls me into his office one fateful day. And he says, hey, I understand you want to be the program manager for the destroyers. Yes, sir. That's good. That's good. That's not where you're going. Because you're going to be the program manager for the LPD 17 class. My jaw just dropped. I've never even been on an amphib. I said, sir, let's think about this. And he goes, look, you're the only guy that's done a lead ship. You've done lead ships in your career. None of the other candidates. We don't have others that have experience in building lead ships. And said, so you're going to have to take the LPD 17, which at the time was going to be the Navy's first Nunn-McCurdy program. And I simply said to Paul, well, then I'm going to have to be an asshole. And he shook his head and says, yep, that's what it'll take. And I don't encourage everybody to be an asshole, but you got to be able to say no. Requirements creep. You got to be able to say no. If you look at the frigates in the penalty box, is requirements creep? I don't know. There's change orders. There's change orders, and depending on what report you read, and there's lots of them out there, and right now SecNav is trying to get down to ground truth. But one of the key issues has been change orders. The program manager has to understand he has the authority, the ability to say no. Fred Parker, no. All right, it's got to be a part of your lexicon, and that you don't wield that unnecessarily, because ultimately you want to deliver to the warfighter's needs. But when you have a set of requirements, when you figure out what it's going to cost to deliver the requirements, and you get a budget that goes with that, and somebody has a better idea what they should be doing, no is a good answer. When I got to LPD 17, you got a change order budget in shipbuilding. Change order budget was all gone. It was completely gone. The program was out of money. It was out of money, zero. That's a different story. But they're still approving changes when they had no money. Got to say no. You just got to understand this is my job. And if the answer is this is really necessary, you've got to do it, then the answer is yes, but I either have to trade something else off to come up with the money, or I need more money. There is no free lunch here. So riding the yes curve until you run out of money, I'll tell you how that ends. Okay.
Thank you very much, sir. This question has to deal with the workforce. And from your perspective, what would you have done differently, or do you have any thoughts on how to better manage the workforce, the acquisition workforce across all the various areas, shipbuilding, aircraft, weapons, the services? Do you have any perspectives on the how to manage that workforce and going forward in a time when there's a little there's uncertainty?
Yeah, well, let me a couple of things here. First off, I was blessed. I was blessed throughout my career. I had great bosses, but equally or more importantly, I had great teams that I was a part of, or teams that worked for me. I touched on LPD 17. Boy, I can give you a list of heroes that I would do anything for these individuals, because what they did to ensure that program ultimately succeeded. Same is true. Dave gave us a similar list on the DG-51 program, and we can go on in that regards in terms of heroes. These individuals that we call the acquisition workforce, they're professionals that are dedicated to the mission, and they'll do whatever it takes to win the war. We need more of them. And so, it's part of it's training, but what it is A, it is experience, and B, it's dedication, and that dedication comes with understanding the criticality of what you're working on and why it's so important that you succeed. And then you see people stepping up. You see people. When I was out in industry, I probably spent half my time just challenging the stereotypes that are out there in terms of private industry regarding, the acquisition workforce. We have professionals that are dedicated, that will give their all to support the warfighter. The challenges that we've got, is the system that we're operating in. And it's hard for these individuals to succeed. And what we need to be doing as leaders is peeling back the weight that is on their shoulders, not associated with delivering the capability, but associated with running through the process. I keep on coming back to that MRAP example. All the rules were cast aside. We, the government, figured out, A, we could do it, B, we had to do it. And so we did it. The problem is, is that when MRAPs were done and the war was done and people forgot, all that process crept back in. And what we need to do is we need to take those lessons and understand how to continually reapply them. And then over time, streamline, et cetera, et cetera. But in the meantime, we got to figure out, and we don't need new law. We got to figure out how to leverage those lessons where needed across our defense acquisition. That requires a smart, hardworking, talented workforce. So, and how to build a workforce? Well, A, give them the experience. B, give them the support. You know, the support I got from Paul Robinson, I love that man, and I would have done anything for him. And C, make sure everybody understands the criticality of the mission that they're working on, and then make the workload match the criticality.
Thank you. Incredibly insightful. And maybe NPS can step up and help with the training and experience with relevant acquisition education as well. We have a few minutes left, sir. 5 minutes. I have one last question, and then you can give your closing remarks. I think, and this one is basically, if you had no constraints right now, you talked about Wayne Meyer's simple principles. What if you had no constraints and you had to do one thing to impact acquisition change or reform or innovation? What would that one change be to with the intent of getting capability to the fleet faster?
You know, I don't think it'll be necessarily a change, but I touched on it lightly. You know, that we're going up against a hell of a threat. And it doesn't matter how you measure this thing. If you go back to the 2015 timeframe, RAND produced a study called Overmatch. And it was a historical timeline up, 30 years prior, 85 to, 10-year slices, 85, 95, 05, 15, and then look forward 30 years. And it measured China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and the US in terms of force structure. The little icons, ships, aircraft, brigades, things of this nature. And the trend that China has been on has been incredible. And the trend that they predicted for the next 30 years was even more incredible, daunting. And here we are 10 years later and on that trend. It's that Xi Jinping plan. In order to go up against that challenge, we need all of government working together. And that's the thing that drives me nuts when people talk about acquisition. There are a lot of good people inside the acquisition system. They're simply not all pulling in the same direction. They're pulling in a direction that they're incentivized by whatever it happens to be in their office that's important. They pull in that direction, but it's not the direction necessarily that the nation needs to be going in to deal with the threat of China. So we need to get all those incentives aligned across all the offices that are involved in acquisition, starting with requirements and going right out to the force. And then we need to get all of government, the whole of government, working on that problem, because that's what it's going to take. There should be no doubt about it. This is not going to be a simple matter. The United States Navy is going to build a 381 ship force, pause, and then that would deal with China. Nope. All of government, everybody aligned, everybody's incentives going in the same direction. What's it going to take to win the war?
Well, fantastic. And we do have a minute, sir. If you'd have any closing remarks, then share with the audience.
Okay, in a minute, 40 seconds here. Hey, look, back in McCain's day, McCain 11, they asked for a number of people to provide 4 pages on what we need to do to fix acquisition. And it became they published a book. So I had the opportunity to provide my 4 pages. My 4 pages were all about the acquisition workforce. It was like, what we need to do to fix acquisition, we need good people. We need good people. Back then, the challenges were different than they are today, but we need good people. And so if I'm talking to the acquisition workforce, the appeal I would make is, you're needed right now where you are. And guess what? This is where you want to be. This is where you have the ability to make the greatest impact. And at this time, you have the opportunity to make that great impact. Stay where you are, run to the sound of the guns, continue to contribute to that great mission that acquisition supports. So thank you, Bob. Thank you, Dave. It's good seeing you again. And I look forward to tuning into the rest of today's panels and remarks.
Thank you very much, sir.